In the turbulent decade of the 1970s, when Asia became the new frontier for young Western travelers seeking freedom, enlightenment, and adventure along the so-called Hippie Trail, a charming but deadly predator lurked in the shadows of India, Nepal, and Thailand. His name was Charles Sobhraj, and to many he was known as the Bikini Killer, a suave conman who used seduction, manipulation, and poison to ensnare his victims. Beneath his handsome appearance and captivating charisma hid one of the most cunning and cold-blooded killers of the era, a man who turned paradise into a hunting ground, leaving behind a trail of bodies. Tourists who came in search of dreams, but found only death. Born in Saigon in 1944 to an Indian father and a Vietnamese mother, Sobhraj's early years were defined by abandonment and instability. His parents separated, and young Charles was raised in a fractured household, often shuttled between relatives. This rootless upbringing left him feeling alienated, desperate for control and attention. He quickly developed a fascination with crime, admiring gangsters and anti-heroes, idolizing figures who bent rules and lived by their own codes. By his teens, he was already dabbling in petty thefts, scams, and frauds. But what separated Sobhraj from common criminals was his intelligence and his gift for manipulation. He was fluent in several languages, adept at reading people, and capable of playing roles: lover, friend, businessman, savior, depending on what the situation demanded. By the late 1960s, Sobhraj was moving across Europe, swindling wealthy women, stealing cars, and cultivating an image of cosmopolitan sophistication. He dressed elegantly, spoke softly, and carried himself with a confidence that disarmed suspicion. When caught, he often manipulated his way out, using charm or feigned illness. But his appetite for control grew. It was no longer enough to deceive. He wanted to dominate completely. Murder became his next step. In the early 1970s, as waves of Western backpackers began traveling through Asia, Sobhraj saw opportunity. These young men and women, many estranged from their families back home, carried money, passports, and a naive trust in strangers. They were far from the protective nets of their societies, eager to embrace adventure. To Sobhraj, they were perfect prey. Operating in Thailand, India, and Nepal, he established a base of operations, often renting luxury apartments or villas to lure travelers. His method was disturbingly calculated. He would befriend tourists, offering guidance, food, or shelter. He exuded sophistication, the kind of man who seemed worldly, safe, even glamorous. Once he gained their trust, he would drug them, sometimes under the guise of curing illness or sharing a drink. The poison weakened his victims, leaving them disoriented, compliant, vulnerable. Then, he robbed them, stripped them of passports and valuables, and in many cases, murdered them to cover his tracks. The nickname Bikini Killer arose after several of his victims, young women, were found dead on beaches in swimwear, their bodies left to the elements. But not all of his victims were women. He targeted men and women alike, anyone whose death would serve his schemes. Some were poisoned and drowned, others were strangled or stabbed. The pattern was as much about control as it was about profit. For Sobhraj, murder was not random violence but a tool, a means to preserve his freedom and instill fear in his accomplices. What made him even more dangerous was his ability to recruit followers. He cultivated a small circle of loyal associates, disaffected young people, often women, who became his accomplices. They helped lure victims, dispose of bodies, and maintain his veneer of charm. One of his closest partners, Marie-André Leclerc, a woman from Quebec, became infatuated with him and assisted in his crimes, sometimes pretending to be his devoted wife while helping him deceive travelers. Another associate, Ajay Chowdhury, became his enforcer. With his small family, Sobhraj played the role of charismatic leader, manipulating them with promises of love, loyalty, and adventure, even as he used them to further his schemes. Victims began to accumulate. In Thailand, Dutch backpackers disappeared after befriending Sobhraj. Their charred bodies were later discovered. In Nepal, Canadian and American travelers were found strangled. In India, a group of French students fell violently ill after sharing food with him. He had poisoned them, but some survived, later testifying against him. The body count climbed, though the exact number remains uncertain. Estimates range from a dozen to over 20 victims, scattered across borders, each case bearing the signature of manipulation, poisoning, and cold-blooded execution. Authorities in several countries began to suspect him, but Sobhraj was slippery. He constantly changed identities using stolen passports to cross borders. He was a master of disguise, altering his appearance with hair dye, clothing, and mannerisms. He played on bureaucracy, exploiting the lack of communication between police forces across countries in that era. Just as investigators began to close in, he vanished into another city, another country, leaving confusion in his wake. Journalists covering his trail described him as a snake, cold, hypnotic, and deadly. And like a snake, he knew when to strike and when to disappear. His arrogance grew with each escape, feeding his belief that he was untouchable. He flaunted wealth, threw parties, lived luxuriously, all financed by the belongings of his victims. Meanwhile, grieving families back in Europe and North America begged for answers, their sons and daughters reduced to nameless corpses in foreign lands. By the mid-1970s, international pressure was mounting. Police in Thailand, Nepal, and India began sharing intelligence. Interpol issued alerts. Yet Sobhraj continued to evade capture. His turning point came not through his crimes, but through his arrogance. In 1976, in New Delhi, he attempted to drug a group of French students by offering them spiked pills pretending to treat dysentery. But the dosage was miscalculated, and the students realized something was wrong. They overpowered him and alerted authorities. For once, his mask had slipped. Sobhraj was arrested and imprisoned in India. But even in prison, his cunning persisted. He bribed guards, manipulated officials, and even managed to escape temporarily. In one notorious incident, he threw a birthday party for fellow inmates and guards, serving them sweets laced with sedatives. As they collapsed around him, he simply walked out of the prison. Though he was later recaptured, the escape cemented his legend, feeding the myth of the untouchable conman. He spent 2 decades in Indian prisons, fighting extradition to Thailand, where he faced the death penalty. His legal maneuvers were as calculated as his crimes, always designed to preserve his life. He was finally released from India in 1997 and returned to Paris, where he lived openly, even giving interviews and selling rights to his story. Astonishingly, he courted fame, basking in the aura of his infamy as if murder had elevated him into a celebrity. But fate had one more twist. In 2003, Sobhraj traveled to Nepal, a country where his past crimes had never been forgotten. Nepali police arrested him on charges of murdering 2 tourists in the 1970s. This time, the evidence held, and in 2004, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. His arrogance had led him back to the scene of his crimes, and finally, justice caught up. Sobhraj remained in prison in Nepal for nearly 2 decades, his once glamorous aura fading into the reality of an aging killer behind bars. In 2022, due to health issues and age, he was released and deported to France, sparking outrage among families of his victims. Even at the end, he remained unrepentant, still cloaked in the manipulative charm that had defined his life. The story of Charles Sobhraj is not only about the murders he committed, but about the way he embodied a particular kind of predator. He was not driven by compulsion in the same way as many serial killers. His murders were entwined with fraud, theft, and manipulation. He killed not just for thrill, but to maintain control, to silence, to dominate. He thrived on exploiting the trust of those seeking beauty and adventure, turning paradise into a graveyard. His legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How many victims truly died at his hands? How did a man so clearly dangerous manipulate his way through borders, prisons, and even the media? Why did the world allow him, for so long, to transform murder into a performance, a spectacle that he controlled? Today, the name Charles Sobhraj lingers as a reminder that evil does not always come with a frightening face. Sometimes it comes dressed in silk shirts, with a charming smile, holding out a friendly hand. Sometimes it waits in the very places where people feel most free, most alive, most adventurous. And sometimes it follows you home, in the nightmares of families who lost their children to the man called the Bikini Killer. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Crimson Narratives for more haunting stories from the darkest corners of human history. Because only by remembering can we honor the victims. And only by telling these stories can we guard against the monsters who walk among us.